All right, welcome back, everyone, for our third session. Thank you for joining. Thank you for sticking with me. This session is on enrichment and extension. It is so significant, in my opinion, that it deserves its own session. And I'll explain where we're going in a moment, but just for the time being, let's take a look at our learning continuum for these sessions. So we've spent our first session observing why percentages are problematic. We recognized explicit learning targets in our last session, and we observed the creation of the learning continuum. So today we're going to try and remember Bloom's taxonomy, rich tasks, and their uses for extension. We'll also complete our learning continuum, but this is where we're heading. But I'd like to just acknowledge that the last session, it was quite something. It was a bit of a doozy, and I promised a wild ride. And I think for some of you, that promise came true. It was just full of curricular jargon and Bloom's taxonomy and all of this stuff that maybe you don't sit a lot with, but I hope that it was something you could wrestle with. And I think today will be we're going to come in for landing in the plane, especially with the last session, but today especially also as we finish that learning continuum. And I hope that we can satisfy some of our thinking. So I'm sure I can hear some of the pushback questions of some people saying, why was there only one target in your learning continuum? What if I want to teach more? How is this supposed to be a helpful tool? The curriculum language is too confusing, and that's true. We shouldn't stick with that. We need to make it student friendly, which I'll explain in a moment. And then a question about marking assignments, that this curriculum, this continuum doesn't change the way that I could still use percentages. That's true. We are getting there. We'll land that plane on the next session. And then the last question I can hear you saying is, you never explain the final column of the continuum. What the heck is up with that? And you know what? I'm going to do that today. But first, let me address the curricular language piece by showing you some student-friendly language. So here on the left, you can see that there is BC teacher and curriculum language, and that is all language from our learning continuum that we created. And on the right, you'll notice that I have rewritten it in student-friendly language. I won't take the time to read all of this, but we'll focus at the top. It says, I can model proportional reasoning in contextualized experiences. That is edu jargon. That's directly from the curriculum. The grade 8 students aren't required to know the curriculum. And I've heard some students, well, they're required to know how to do the curriculum. They're not required to know the language. And I've heard some teachers say, you know what? Those students just need to learn how to use the language. They just need to learn to understand it. And to that, I say, absolutely not. That is not their job. Our job is to make it as accessible as possible. So when it says proportional reasoning, to an 8th grade student, there is no difference between proportional reasoning and proportions. So I will use the language that's more accessible. And I will also completely nix contextualized experiences. That will happen regardless. Contextualized experiences, when we model them, there will be contextualized experiences. I'll make sure of that such that we can make it more accessible. We need to think not only about what would be synonymous, but also about linguistic economics. So I can find synonyms, but they need to be of equal educational value when I write student-friendly language. And you can see the rest. I've written even more for each I can statement. In the learning continuum, there should be a student-friendly version. So let's take a look at our learning continuum here. This is our teacher, content, curricular competency. This is our curricular, curricular learning continuum. There is a student version of this that we will call a learning map, okay? And it looks like this. So this is a document that can be given to students ahead of the unit being taught, and it has all of the same types of language, except it's rewritten for students. So at the top, it says, big goal, I can model proportions. Instead of clarifying proficiency, it says, when I'm proficient, I can model proportions. This means that I can identify a real-life context that can be replicated as a proportional model. This means that I can construct a proportional model with accuracy, care, and pride. This means I can demonstrate how proportions are modeled in the constructed model. And this means that I can calculate proportions with accuracy, all steps in algebra, not cross multiplication. As students progress through this unit of study or this learning continuum, they can highlight the skills or knowledge that they've acquired. So when you teach the lesson on what is a ratio and they understand it, we can highlight that and we can make our way through this learning continuum much like a learning ladder, which I'll show you a learning ladder in a moment. Now, someone asked, or not someone asked, but I thought about how can we assess things? We haven't completely left percentages. We can use something that's called a single point rubric. And a single point means a single goal. And single goals are better. So many people are saying, what if I want to teach more? What they're actually saying is, what if I want to assess more? You see those tests that have knowledge questions, comprehension questions, and application questions. Well, which is the most important? See, for us, when we are learning to apply proportions, all of these exploring the goal sections, the next I must know or do this, those are being accomplished. Those comprehension goals are being accomplished. So I don't need to worry about what I am assessing or not assessing when I just set one target. And then it makes it fantastically simple to assess on a single point rubric, which looks like this. Here we have a single point rubric, and you'll notice that at the top is the target and in the middle is all of the success criteria in student-friendly language. And what I can do is when I look at their final assignment, I can take a line and I can draw it from each piece of criteria either to areas of strength and make a comment or areas of growth and make a comment. And as I do that, students will start to know where it is that they are growing or strong. And that was clear in the fractions test. Remember the fractions test that we rewrote so that students could see exactly where they were with each goal, or each piece of criteria even, not just an overarching proportions or fractions. Now you'll notice in the previous documents, I've filled in that extension or enriching understanding. And at the bottom of this rubric, you'll see that it says extending your learning. I can model the golden ratio using a proportional model. We'll discuss that in further detail as we move forward. Before we completely dive into enrichment and extension, I would like to show you one more example, and this is called a learning ladder. On the next slide, I'll show it to you zoomed in so you can read it closer. Here you can see a learning ladder with a goal at the top. This is from the Mathematics 7 curriculum, and this is a learning ladder that was created by my colleague, Megan Churchill-Brown, and the idea for learning ladders came from a BC educator named Jen Morose. So at the top, it says, I can use operations with decimals. And there is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Each step gets you closer to achieving proficiency. And all of those I can statements are I can statements from building readiness and exploring the goal. So this is another student-friendly way that students can get their hands on something like a learning continuum and start to engage with how they're progressing towards a goal rather than earning different points across a unit for a final percentage. Please note that all of the documents that I've provided are in the appendix, including the learning ladder. So if that's a template that interests you, you can find that in the appendices. You can find all of the learning continuums in the appendices, as well as learning continuums for Math 8, for ratios and the Pythagorean theorem, and 2 for Math 7 as well. So middle school teachers, you can feast your eyes on different templates and whatnot. For a moment, let's hit pause on learning continuums, and let's talk about extension and enrichment in the classroom. Have you ever been tasked with extension or providing enrichment for students that are reaching proficiency early? Have you ever gotten an email from a parent that says, my child is bored in class. Could you please provide more challenging work? What I want you to hear is that this is difficult. So if you've ever felt that this is going to be too hard for me, it is one of the most difficult parts of teaching, to differentiate and individualize practice for each student. But what I want you to hear is that the method that I began to learn that uses rich tasks, Bloom's taxonomy, and learning continuums has drastically changed the way that I see assessment and enrichment. It has unlocked enrichment and extension for me in the mathematics classroom. And I'm hoping that for you, it can do the same. Let's begin with another vignette. Here's a student situation. A student demonstrates that they understand the grade level unit and takes the initiative to ask for mathematics that will challenge them. That's very admirable that the student has responsibility, and the teacher responds as such. Once the student's grade level work is completed, they're encouraged to do more work on the same target, work on future pages of a textbook, or watch tutorials for future grade levels of mathematics. I could rephrase it like this. The student comes and says, I've finished this, I get this, could I have something more challenging? And the teacher either photocopies another worksheet on the same topic that they had in their back pocket, gives it to them, or they flip pages of the textbook and say, hey, you know what? We're going to be learning about the Pythagorean theorem next. How about you give that a try? Or they say, have you ever heard of Khan Academy? They have some cool math tutorials that you should check out for grade 9 math. All three of those are not the best option, and you've probably heard it before. I think all three of these are actually ways of ignoring our successful students, which is too bad. And I think if you've seen something like this, it may seem like a good way to challenge students and encourage their responsibility, but in the end, this extension dampens their love for mathematics and their responsibility initiative. So here are some ways that we could start to think differently about extension. And let's begin with some wisdom from Katie White's 2017 book, Softening the Edges. Plan learning experiences for students who need enrichment, so they're not just doing more of the same things. Don't just copy extra worksheets. It needs to be different. It's helpful to consider enrichment even before we dive into instruction so that we are ready to respond when students demonstrate proficiency before their peers. When we expect some students will reach proficiency early, we should be ready with new opportunities to explore goals more deeply and in new ways. The key is that the learning we are inviting students to do at this stage is different learning, not more of the same. Otherwise, students will learn very quickly that enrichment simply means doing more work than everyone else, which does little to address their needs.